Good afternoon, everyone. I am Gabriel Miller. I am the Executive Director for the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. I am pleased to welcome you all here this afternoon for this very important session on the recruitment and retention of faculty from racialized and other equity-seeking groups. First, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather to hold the 2018 Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences is Treaty 4 land, the territories of the Nehi'owuk, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota nations, and the homeland of the Métis. I want to thank these Indigenous communities for welcoming us here, and of course, I want to thank Vianne Timmins and her team for the outstanding job they've done of organizing this Congress and making us feel so welcome here in Regina. Just a quick word, partly about Vianne, before I give her a formal introduction. As we, I think, all know, thanks to the vision of Vianne, one of the defining features of this year's Congress is an all-women lineup of big thinking speakers. And just before Congress, there was this newspaper story where Vianne was asked to explain why it was so important to her, and I got the question too, why are you doing this? And I said, well, the real reason we're doing it is because Vianne Timmins had the vision to say we should, and then we all saw, as time went on, what a great idea it was. But when I was asked, why should you do it? I think the answer is because it's a great chance to learn. It is a great chance for us to hear perspectives of people that really have value for us. And that's why today's session is also a great opportunity for me, because it's a chance for me to listen and learn. And that's what Congress is all about, in my opinion. So I have the difficult task to introduce Vianne briefly, because her list of accomplishments is certainly very long. She has taken a leading role in establishing the strategic direction of the university since 2008, when she became the 7th president and vice chancellor. Under her leadership, new life has been given to the institution's threefold academic mission of teaching, research, and service to community. The focus on key areas such as student and employee engagement, teaching and research excellence, and the education of Indigenous students has yielded compelling results. Dr. Timmins maintains a wide-ranging research program with particular emphasis on family literacy and inclusive education. She is active in the academic community regionally, nationally, and internationally, currently serving as the past president of the International Association for the Scientific Study of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, chair of University Canada's Standing Committee on International Relations, board member of the Consortium for North American Higher Education Collaboration, and a member of the Canada Foundation for Innovation. Without further delay, I am inviting Dr. Timmins to take the lead on running this session.
Thank you, Gabriel. Gabriel, you're supposed to sit up here with us, I think.
Oh, I am.
Yeah, right there. There's a chair for you. Thank you for acknowledging these lands we are on. So important, part of our history, but more important, a part of our children's futures. And that's why we must, it's an imperative that we acknowledge lands that we are on. And it's a fitting acknowledgement to begin this panel on the subject of recruitment and retention of faculty members from racialized and other equity-seeking groups. And I'm hoping this isn't going to be a feel-good panel. I don't really want it to be a feel-bad panel, but we have no reason to be self-congratulatory on how diverse our institutions are, especially in terms of faculty. We need to push, we need to be provocative, and we need to not accept the status quo. And that's what I've asked our three panelists to do today. Let me give you an example of my own institution that I'm very proud of, the University of Regina. We are a more inclusive campus than ever in our history. Students with disabilities are up nearly 300% in the past decade. International and Indigenous students are up more than 100% over that time. 14% of our student population is international, 13% self-declared Indigenous, female students with great balance. 45% of our academic staff are women. 55% of our employees overall are women. We can say we moved to be more inclusive, but we aren't doing that well in other areas. Our Indigenous employees, we only have 3.2% in a community that's close to 15%. So my student population is reflecting the community fairly well, but not my employees. Employees with disabilities, 2.5% at my campus. Visible minority employees, 11%, so we are not bad in that area. Indigenous academics, only 2.7%. Academics with disabilities, not even 1%, 0.9%. And visible minority academics, I've said we do well, 10%. My hunch is all our institutions are similar, all of ours. There's increasing proof that diversity and equity are critical, important, and necessary. And our panelists are going to explore these ideas today with us. So how are we going to do this? We are going to have a highlight presentation by Dr. Melinda Smith. She'll take 15 minutes. And Melinda, I'll be very tight on the time with that. Then the panel discussion will arise from that. Will take us about 35 minutes. We'll have questions and answers for 45 minutes. And then we'll have closing comments from Gabriel. We're going to try to end about 3:15 because Melinda and I both have another panel we have to go to. But if we're really doing well and you're really engaged, then Gabriel will continue the discussion with you, right?
Absolutely.
So let me introduce our panelists. Dr. Melinda Smith is a professor of political science at the University of Alberta. She teaches international relations, gender, and politics, among many other areas. She is co-author of the book, The Equity Myth, Racialization and Indigeneity at Canadian Universities. She's edited 3 other books, many awards and honors she's had, including ISA Canada Distinguished Scholar Award. She also serves on the Advisory Committee on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Policy. Let's give her a big hand. Dr. Wesley Cricklow teaches at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. He is the first Associate Dean of Equity at that institution, and his work focuses on critical equity studies, social justice, human rights, community-university collaborations. He's interested in the challenges to implementing policies and practices that strengthen broader notions of diversity and social justice in educational institutions. He has recently been appointed the Equity Director for the Federation of the Humanities and Social Sciences. Let's give him a big hand. Dr. Michelle Owen from the University of Winnipeg is a professor of women and gender studies and also the coordinator of disability studies. It's an area which Michelle, have particular interest, so I'm going to be listening carefully to what you say so I can learn. Her research interests include gender, disability, chronic illness, violence, and sexuality. She's co-authored the article, How Crip is Too Crip, Reimagining the Presence of Disabled Professors in the Academy, just recently published 2018. She has served on the COUT Working Group for Women Academic Staff and also the University of Winnipeg's Employment Equity Advisory Committee. We couldn't have better panelists. I'm really excited about listening to what they have to say, and I'm looking forward to hearing your interaction and engagement with us. So let's begin with Melinda, and she will highlight some issues and set the stage for our discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Timmons. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to also acknowledge that we are in treaty for territories and to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples who have been caretakers of this land for time immemorial. And in making this acknowledgement, it is not to be part of a pro forma recitement of the territories, but actually to say that in acknowledging that the traditional caretakers of the land in the territories and the waters, that we are also engaged in an ongoing decolonial process. So it is actually to speak to our colonial present. In this presentation, I want to do a few things quite briefly as an overview of the pursuit of equity, diversity, and inclusion in Canadian universities, an enterprise that we have been a part of for the last 33 years. So let me offer a first introduction. I think I want to say first why it matters that we pay attention to this, and I'll be elaborating this more in the next session. But diversity with equity matters in our student body, and it matters among non-academic staff, in the professoriate, and in university leadership. It matters to individuals, to groups, communities, and firms as an expression of our collective desire to be treated fairly and also to be treated to be fair, i.e. to model fairness. The challenge of diversity with equity especially matters to those in situations where it's not popular or easy to say so. It matters in equity legislation and as law and as a body of rules or principles of fairness and justice. In our ever more diverse democracy, equity matters in politics as an expression of democratic equality and human rights. And it matters in policy, employment equity, and our diversity policies as an expression of our commitment to ameliorating implicit biases, systemic discrimination, and continuing unfairness in social outcomes. Equity, in other words, is fundamentally about justice and fairness. Its principles and practices exceed mere equity as compliance or mechanical applications of legal precedent or bureaucratic rules or procedures. So with that in mind, let me make this quote from the late Tony Judd. He said, what is living and what is dead in social democracy, he asked. Why do we have such a difficulty even imagining a different sort of society or university from the one whose dysfunctions and inequalities trouble us so? We appear to have lost the capacity to question the present, much less offer alternatives to it. Why is it so beyond us to conceive of a different set of arrangements to our common advantage? And here I'm thinking of a different set of arrangements to the inequitable one in which we teach and work and learn. Liz Coleman, former president of Bennington College, eloquently noted that deep thought matters when you are thinking about things that matter. Yet when it comes to transformation, she argued, the academy is more likely to engender a learned helplessness than to create a sense of empowerment. One continuing challenge in the 21st century Canadian universities is to engage in deep thinking about diversity with equity and how and why it matters to actively promoting the advancement of women, Aboriginal peoples, racialized minorities, and persons with disabilities, as well as LGBTQ and two-spirit individuals in ways that model a profound commitment to fundamental fairness and educational equity, access, and outcome. In some universities, there's efforts underway at the highest levels to advance next generation thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion in plural societies. But I'm going to argue, quite provocatively, I've been told, to suggest that we have had 33 years of this project, and we need to think carefully about whether the commitment that universities have been making more recently, 2017, Universities Canada committed to 7 principles on inclusive excellence. The Canada Research Chairs Program committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion policies in the Research Chairs programs. And what I want to say, I will come back to this later, is that these, in some ways, draw our attention to compliance. Universities comply with these. But there's another kind of question that we ought to be attentive to. To what extent is there a bottom-up effort to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion? So on the screen, you see a quote from Justice Rosalie Silverman-Abella, who chaired the Royal Commission on Equality and Employment. And I'd like to start with this quote because I think it's actually fundamental for us to think about why equity, diversity, and inclusion matters. What Rosalie Silverman-Abella noted was that these biases, systemic discrimination, barriers and obstacles to a more inclusive academy will not disappear on their own, that they are formidable, they are self-perpetuating, and that it's intolerable and insensitive if we simply wait and hope that the barriers will disappear with time. It will not happen unless we make it happen. We have Section 15 of the Charter employment equity legislation, human rights legislation, all give us the tools to ensure we can make equity happen. So if it's not happening, if we still have underrepresentation of women, a third of the academy, and that's the 2018 underrepresented and underpaid Canadian Association of Universities Teachers Report, women remain a third of the academy. That's been true for decades. Indigenous peoples are 1.4% of Canadian Academy. Visible minorities or racialized minorities are 21.2%, and persons with disabilities are about 3%, but my view is that it's grossly distorted number because we actually don't know the fulsome nature of racial, we don't know the fulsome nature of invisible versus visible disabilities. So after 30 years of Royal Commission Equality in Employment, I put this up here for you to think about your university, whether your university is still in denial stage, we don't have an equity problem, whether it's in a compliance stage, we are doing it because somebody else told us to do it, the legislation, the TRC, CRC program, whether we're beyond compliance, whether we are following the business case, or we are integrating equity into our teaching, research, and engagement, and whether we can actually say our universities, and all of that it does, is reflective of this equitable academy. The one thing I want to say then is that we need to understand this rubric of diversity. I draw on Sarah Ahmed's work on being included, where she says we actually have to follow that word around, follow equity, diversity, inclusion around to see what work they do, right? Because universities issue these statements. They issue policy reports. They have glossy websites. We have equity statements in our hiring policy, but who follows them around to measure what kind of success? What kind of metrics do we have to determine success? How do we know that, in fact, we are a welcoming and inclusive university? What does that mean, actually? So what we need to do is actually think about the ways in which equity and diversity operate in our university. I also think it's important for us to think about the difference between equity, diversity, and inclusion. Equity policy, policy, and practice emerged in the context of a specific governing philosophy and rationality. They were shaped by social justice movements, by human rights movements, by the struggles for equality, and they were informed by the welfare state. Diversity is somewhat different. It's informed by instrumental logics. It's not rooted in this history of human rights. And so I don't think they do the same kind of work, and I don't think we ought to think about them in the same kind of way. Equity is more connected, as I said, to anti-discrimination and to this idea of the social collective, whereas diversity can quickly become focused on individualized rhetorics. Okay, so let me go more. So university statements, all of you who teach and work in universities would have been hired with statements that says, we welcome. Okay, and you see here sorry, I pushed it on my screen, but not yours. Okay, so Carl James at York and Annette Henry both have written about articles on we welcome statements, and to say who follow them around to see how we are welcome. Does welcoming visible minorities or racialized minorities require the same kind of work as welcoming women or welcoming people with disabilities? In other words, my view is that universities have been pursuing a one-size-fits-all since the 1980s. Why did this happen? In the 1980s, when most equity policies came into being, universities had data on the status of women. They did not have as much data on the other equity-seeking groups. Okay, so what they did was said, okay, we'll start with women, and other equity-seeking groups will follow. What that led to, in my view, is what I call the dividing practices. What the dividing practices did is it led to us saying women and the other equity-seeking groups, so that visible minorities, indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities became the other, women and other. That language actually is a dividing practice. Now we are saying gender and the other equity-seeking group, but it does the same kind of work. Okay, and because it says, when you otherize the other equity-seeking groups, it means then that we don't name them, but we don't know them or follow them around. We had styles of women advisors, we had women's directorates, and so we have a better infrastructure for women than we have for the other groups. So just hold that thought in mind, because it says to you, what do you actually know about what universities are doing for racialized minorities? What infrastructure do they have? What kind of advisory policies do they have? What kind of harassment or discrimination policies do we have? In my view, if you look at that for racialized academics, what you will see is that they are non-performative. They don't do what they actually say. And here I'm borrowing on Sarah Ahmed. And that for racialized minorities, they often encounter the university as a brick wall, where they try to find support, but there is little of it. There's symbolic commitments in terms of us being on brochures. I often find myself on many brochures. But when it comes to getting support and services, they are very little. So why don't we have more why don't we have more racialized minorities on Canadian campuses? One is there's deficit thinking. They're not qualified. So we will talk in the next panel about the disjuncture between equity and excellence. The second argument they make is they're not available. The recent COUT report, underrepresented and underpaid, that came out in 2018, about a month ago, indicates, in fact, that racialized minorities with PhDs are underemployed. Black scholars are 10.7%, South Asians 10.3%, Aboriginal people about 7.6%. So if you go, so they are available but underemployed. They're not getting their foot in the door. There's a double standard. We change the standards or rules, or we do whatever is necessary to hire who we want. But whenever you try to hire racialized minorities, indigenous peoples, we say we have to play by the rules. There's a tendency for cultural cloning, and we're not serious about it. So quickly, Philomena Estes says that what this is about is that one of the problems we have an underrepresentation of racialized scholars is because we are engaged in a process of preference for the sameness. That is, we are cloning ourselves. We are hiring people like ourselves. And that reproduction of the same means then that we have this kind of table where we have Aboriginal workforce is 3.8%, students 5%, professors 1.4%. We have a situation, this is some research that I will be releasing later this week on racialized scholars, where I'm trying to do for the first time a pipeline for racialized scholars. 40% of undergrads, 31% of PhDs, 21.2% of professors, but 6% of university presidents. Aboriginal people are about 5% of university presidents, and so on. And you see that there is differences for groups. Women, again, the pipeline, you see the leaky pipeline where women are 61% of bachelor's degrees. By the time you get university president, that is 20%, and the numbers aren't changing. So it seems to me that whatever Universities Canada say, whatever university presidents say, my view is there is a blockage somewhere, whether the rhetoric is not translating into action. But I have been carefully following all year long since Universities Canada issued this statement, the appointment of every dean, associate dean, president, and I don't see much difference. Okay? If you follow the data around, you don't see much difference. So I'm not saying, it's not translating. And here is my own research for the Academic Women's Association, which tells you what you see is an intersectionality fail. If you look at the level of the dean, the pipeline, what you see is virtually no visible minorities and certainly few women, but all the women are white and all the men are white, except the racialized minority men. There's about 7 of them in presidents. Okay, all right. They are all from science and engineering, so we can talk about why they're from STEM disciplines, why they're from the STEM disciplines. So my view is there remains a disjuncture between equity, theory, talk, practice. The question is, why that is the case 33 years after employment equity legislation? My view is we have to put the responsibility at the door of university leadership and the shift between rhetoric and action. And we need to hold them accountable. Thank you.
Just to some closing remarks that speak a little bit to the conversation about the Federation, but also to what I think we heard today. I think in a lot of ways the Federation is in the same place that the universities that you're describing are, and that we're wrestling with the challenge that I heard about in today's discussion, which is the challenge of going from signs of diversity, gestures of diversity, interest in diversity, to a much deeper idea and a much, much deeper commitment. And we have an outgoing board member named Cindy Blackstock, who's a well-known Indigenous advocate, and she's been a big help to me. And when I went to her and I talked to her a little bit about what should we do next, you know, what are the things on our list, she really said, in so many words, you need to focus on changing yourselves, because that's what's going to sustain the kind of changes we're talking about. And what I'm struck by when I hear a conversation like the one today is the only way to change ourselves and these organizations is to really have a deep and real collaboration with people who are different. And that's not just going to make us do things that are difficult. It's going to make us do things we don't even know we need to do. And being open to the fact that as we get more diverse, we're also going to have to be open to changes we can't even anticipate. I think that is part of what makes it scary for some people, but I also think it's the part of this we should embrace, because it makes it in some ways so exciting. And it's exciting to listen to it as part of a conversation like this. So I really want to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. It's been a huge benefit to me. Thank you, Vianne, for your leadership shepherding this conversation, and thank you to all of you for being here and part of it.